this video, we turn to the question of what we mean when we say that illness is socially constructed. As we saw in part 1, social constructionism calls attention to the taken for granted nature of phenomena and the social practices that rely on it. The idea that illness is socially constructed can initially be quite challenging. And this is because it is something that we really do take for granted in our society as just a bodily reality. But as one anthropologist famously stated, the last thing fish would notice is water. Likewise, we can feel a bit like fish out of water when we notice that what we take for granted as just the way things are hasn't always been that way in our society, or perhaps is different in other cultures or countries. The ways that we make sense of illness in our own culture seem self-evident, as most of us have always seen illness, as I said, as a physical reality. The ways we respond, whatever that might be at the time and place, through prayer, bloodletting, chemotherapy, seem like the most logical and even natural things to do. Considering these understandings and responses as specific to our worldview and a worldview of a particular time and place can be a bit jarring.
Stepping out of our frame of reference, whether this is by looking at other cultures or back in time at our own culture, allows us to see how social meanings about health and illness are recreated in social interactions across place and time. Let's consider 2 examples.
So first, I want to look at a cultural variation, and that is the example of premenstrual syndrome, or what we would call PMS, which would be familiar to many of us living in Western cultures. What we might be surprised to find is that PMS is an example of a culture-bound or culture-specific disease because it's subject to a particular set of cultural beliefs and practices rather than a tangible medical truth that is universally recognized across all cultures. So culture-bound syndromes have also been called psychosomatic diseases because they have a combination of psychological and bodily or somatic symptoms. And importantly, these are recognizable only within a specific society or culture. PMS has been called a highly culture-bound syndrome by researchers who noted that this was the changes leading up to bodily and emotional changes leading up to menstruation were uniquely experienced by Western women. And PMS comprises a group of physical and emotional symptoms that are experienced by many Western women in the days leading up to the menstrual period, including mood swings, irritability, anger, anxiety, depression, and fatigue. And what distinguishes this syndrome is the psychological changes that accompany bodily changes, so changes in mood or emotion. And what researchers noted is that these psychological changes are not reported by women from other countries. They focus primarily on physical changes. So, for example, Chinese women report water retention, pain, and cold sensitivity as bodily changes in the lead up to their menstrual period. So PMS is understood as a sociocultural phenomenon related to Western gender norms. And it's been linked to the underlying myth of the irrational female, the idea that women are pathologically emotional. And this supports Western cultural constructions of the premenstrual phase as a time of psychological disturbance and debilitation. So what researchers have noticed is that how women and their bodies are viewed by the society in which they live impacts symptom perception concerning premenstrual bodily changes.
The example of PMS highlights the connections between how a bodily experience is conceptualized by a cultural group and how it is then experienced, understood, and dealt with by members of that group, both the individuals who are experiencing these bodily changes as well as on a societal level more broadly. It shows how sensations, bodily sensations, might be given significance or not by that cultural group, and how they explain it differently as people draw on the knowledges of their meaning systems that are available to them and exist within their specific cultural context. The example of culture bound illnesses in general advance the social constructionist claim that illness and disease are something beyond fixed realities. They are also phenomena shaped by social experiences, shared cultural traditions, and shifting frameworks of knowledge. Cross-cultural comparisons show the variation in meanings from one culture to the next. So the other way that I said we can step out of our own frame of reference is to look at our own culture, but to look back in time at how meanings and understandings have changed.
How people feel about their body shape and weight is a powerful example of how culture and historical differences affect how people think about health. So these vintage advertisements show how skinniness was once associated with poor health and unattractiveness. So we might think and ponder a bit on why this might have been the case at this particular time. What were the contextual factors that shaped this particular understanding of this body shape as healthy or unhealthy? In Western countries, especially the US and some parts of Europe, how people think about body weight has changed in recent years, though. So we know, definitely know, that being thin has become increasingly seen as a sign of health, opposite to what it was at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is related also to beauty and success. So during the later part of the 20th century, the cultural idea of thinness became more popular and was promoted by the growth of the mass media. Fashion played a role, and medical discourse stressed the dangers of obesity as people's lifestyles started to shift and change in modernity, where people used cars and had more desk-based jobs, for example. So we see there the contextual factors driving this meaning. So thinness may have been seen as a sign of being poor or sick or not getting enough food or not seen as being successful or beautiful back in the day. And vintage advertisements for weight gain, medication, and exercise plans illustrate that at points of time in the West, weight gain was aspired to as earnestly as many aspire to weight loss today. So, this historical change in what we consider to be a healthy body and a good looking body illustrates how cultural norms and values shape perceptions of physical health and influence our diets, exercise, and body image behaviors. Now, if we just quickly take a look at other cultures, we know that larger bodies are often seen as signs of wealth and fertility and social status in many societies, both historically and in the present day. So, for example, in some cultures, particularly parts of Africa and Polynesia, larger body sizes were traditionally associated with prosperity. And this is still the case today. And I would encourage you to listen to the clip by Nancy Chen, who discusses the changes in body ideals over time. It's important to note that saying an illness is socially constructed does not mean it has no biological basis. Social constructionists are not saying that illness is made up or that people aren't really suffering or in pain. Taking a social constructionist perspective means seeing illness as having both a biological basis and a symbolic dimension. Both biological and social factors affect the social meanings that people give to certain conditions and to health and illness in general. Remember, social constructionists are interested in consensus reality, the shared social reality that we create. Our experience of reality is always mediated through language, which frames and structures our thoughts and perceptions. When we apply this point to health, we can see that social and cultural factors influence how we as individuals and societies understand bodily anomalies, and then in turn, how we respond to these and interact with doctors and people that treat and care for the sick. When we study health and illness from a social constructionist perspective, we focus on how cultural and social systems shape meanings and experiences of sickness or bodily impairment. And the value of using a social constructionist lens is that it shines a light on, as I said, humans as social animals, as social beings. And this has often been left out in studies of health and illness, which focus primarily on the physical and on the body. So, researchers across a range of disciplines, including critical health psychology, have used a social constructionist perspective to try and bring the social back into the picture, because it is a really important part of health and illness, which we look at in this course. So these researchers generally consider the three following focal areas, and these are identified by Conrad and Barker. First, they look at the cultural meaning of illness. So illness carries cultural meanings like abnormality or immorality or danger, and this affects how society treats people with those illnesses and how people themselves experience their illness. Another focal point is the subjective experience of illness. So how people understand and deal with the condition that they have is through drawing on personal meanings as well as social meanings. And this really shapes how they experience what it means to have cancer or HIV or syphilis, which have very different social connotations attached to them. And then the third focal area is on the social production of medical knowledge. And the argument here is that instead of being value neutral, medical knowledge can reflect and perpetuate social norms and understandings, including the inequities that they perpetuate, and in turn can potentially serve the interests of the powerful.